The courtroom smelled like polished wood and tension. My mother sat beside my sister, whispering behind manicured hands like conspirators at a funeral. When I walked in, Vanessa's smirk was waiting for me, sharp and satisfied, the same one she used when she thought she'd already won. Reporters murmured, their cameras clicking, the sound of judgment already beginning. The bailiff called my name, and every eye turned. I kept walking, my heels steady against the tile floor. Then Judge Burke looked up from his notes, his pen stilling midair. For a long second he just stared. Then slowly he stood. "Wait," he said, voice cutting through the silence. "You're the new CEO." His tone wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. The room shifted. My mother's lips parted, her perfectly powdered face draining of color. Vanessa's smirk faltered, her confidence cracking in front of everyone. I didn't speak, I just nodded once. They had no idea who I really was. The hum of whispers filled the courtroom. Someone from the press gasped. The judge cleared his throat and sat back down, visibly resetting his composure. "All right, let's begin," he said. "Court is now in session." I sat behind my attorney, but I didn't really see him. My gaze stayed locked on my mother and sister, two women who had spent their lives treating me like an afterthought. Elaine and Vanessa Collins, my family by blood but strangers by choice. Across the aisle, Vanessa leaned in to whisper something to our mother. They both looked at me with a mix of disdain and disbelief, as if my existence was an inconvenience. Elaine had chosen a black dress, elegant but performative, the kind meant to say, grieving widow. She even dabbed at imaginary tears when the cameras turned her way. Vanessa wore navy, her power suit a deliberate statement, the image of control, of righteousness. My father used to say they cared more about optics than truth. He wasn't wrong. The irony of it all nearly made me laugh. 6 months earlier, my father, Charles Collins, had passed away, leaving behind a global logistics empire he'd built from nothing. Ships, ports, contracts across 4 continents, and me, his younger daughter, who no one thought capable of running it. For years, I was the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the boardroom drama, the one who made sure Dad took his medication and didn't overwork himself after his heart surgery. While they chased parties, politics, and PR, I chased knowledge. I learned everything about the business in silence. I shadowed my father's meetings, memorized every signature, every clause in every deal. They thought I was invisible. When he died, his will named me as the sole heir to Collins Maritime Group CEO, majority shareholder, executor of his estate. My mother and sister's outrage was biblical. They claimed I manipulated a dying man. That I took advantage of his grief after years of illness. That I stole the company that should have gone to the real heirs. They filed the lawsuit 2 weeks after the funeral. Not a condolence card, not a call. Just papers. The judge shuffled his notes. "Plaintiffs, your opening statement," he said. Vanessa's attorney, a man named William Hart, stood. He was slick, rehearsed, too smooth for his own good. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a case about betrayal within a family business. A case where greed overshadowed love. A young woman driven by ambition isolated her dying father and manipulated him into rewriting his will, cutting out his wife and eldest daughter. We intend to prove undue influence and restore justice to this family." Justice. I almost smiled. They wouldn't know justice if it bit them. My attorney Daniel remained calm beside me, jotting notes. I didn't look at him. I was watching my mother. Her hands trembled slightly, the only thing betraying the performance. For years, she'd been the perfect socialite, graceful, respected the face of every charity gala my father sponsored. But underneath that polished veneer was someone who believed affection was currency. She gave love only when it served her. I learned that early. When my turn came, Daniel stood. "Your Honor, this case is not about greed. It's about truth. The truth of who showed up and who didn't. The truth of who actually ran this company in its final years and who only showed up when there was money to gain." He gestured to me briefly, then to the table stacked with files and binders. "We will prove that Charles Collins made his decision freely, soundly, and intentionally. The evidence will show a lifetime of responsibility, not manipulation." Judge Burke nodded thoughtfully, his eyes flicking toward me again. There was something almost protective in the way he looked at me, though I didn't know why yet. He knew me. I could see it. The rest of the morning blurred into motions and objections. Elaine avoided eye contact. Vanessa pretended confidence, but I caught her fidgeting with her wedding ring, spinning it over and over like a nervous tick. She'd inherited our mother's habit of mistaking control for power, and like our mother, she'd never learned the difference between power and respect. As the clerk read through the case summary, my mind drifted. I remembered standing in my father's office the day before the funeral. His desk still smelled like cedar and coffee. I could almost hear him saying, "You'll do fine, Mandy. You're the only one who understands what this company stands for." He'd trusted me. He'd prepared me for this moment, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. The judge's gavel snapped me back. "We'll recess until after lunch," he announced. He stood, and again his gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. Then he left through the side door. As people began to file out, Vanessa turned in her seat and smirked again. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she murmured just loud enough for me to hear. "Dad's not here to protect you anymore." I leaned closer, my voice low but steady. "No, he's not," I said, "but he taught me how to protect myself. That's the difference." Her smile faltered. She turned away. Reporters swarmed the hallway, calling out questions. I ignored them, walking straight past the cameras, the microphones, the curious eyes. My pulse was steady. Inside, though, something was burning, a mix of grief, anger, and something darker. Determination. Back in my car, I sat for a long moment staring at the courthouse steps. The same steps where my father once stood after winning a lawsuit against a corrupt shipping conglomerate. He'd been my hero. Now it was my turn to defend his name, his legacy, and the truth he built. "They think they know me," I whispered to the empty car. "They have no idea." Because the truth was, this long before he died, my father had seen what my mother and sister truly were. Users, manipulators, people who valued money over integrity. And he had trained me quietly, methodically, to carry the company forward without them. This lawsuit wasn't just about inheritance. It was about justice, about honoring what he built, and proving that family is defined by loyalty, not blood. I took a breath, opened the car door, and stepped back into the afternoon Sunday. I wasn't that quiet daughter anymore. I was the CEO of Collins Maritime Group, and tomorrow, when court resumed, they'd finally see who I really was. If they wanted the truth, I'd give them the truth from the very beginning. The house still smelled like lilies from the funeral. They were wilting now, browning at the edges, filling every room with that sweet, heavy scent of something trying too hard to stay alive. I sat in my father's study, the one place that still felt like him. His books lined the shelves: naval history, trade law, business strategy, each one marked with his notes in the margins. On the desk sat the letter from his attorney, sealed and waiting. Reading of the will, Tuesday, 10 a.m. The words blurred every time I looked at them. The sunlight caught the corner of his model ship, the one he'd been building for years but never finished. The sails were still half wrapped in tissue paper. I ran my fingers along the wooden deck and whispered, "You always said ships outlast people." My voice sounded small in the silence. I hadn't realized how much sound he filled until it was gone. Charles Collins built everything with his hands and his mind. Collins Maritime Group wasn't just a company. It was his entire identity, a shipping empire born from one broken-down dock in Savannah. He'd started as a harbor clerk, worked his way up through sheer willpower, and by the time I was born, the Collins name was stamped on every major port from Miami to Lisbon. He liked to say he didn't inherit legacy, he created it. When I was a little girl, I'd sit under the conference table during board meetings, doodling cargo ships, while he negotiated contracts worth millions. No one noticed me, but he always did. "Keep listening, Mandy," he'd whisper on his way out. "You learn more when people think you're invisible." He taught me how to read balance sheets like novels, how to spot a liar by the way they avoided eye contact, and how real leadership wasn't about having a title. It was about showing up when no one else would. My mother never understood that. Elaine liked the spotlight, the parties, the photographs. She was the elegant face of our family business, the woman smiling beside my father at charity galas. But when it came to the company itself, the people, the numbers, the responsibility, she called it men's work. My sister Vanessa followed her lead. She studied marketing, moved to Los Angeles, and talked endlessly about brand image. Between the two of them, they turned our family name into something polished but hollow. For years, they treated me like a background character in their glossy narrative. Too quiet, too serious, too much like Dad. When he had his first heart attack, they sent flowers. I flew home and took over his schedule. By the time he retired, he'd already started transferring knowledge to me quietly, methodically, without ever saying the words. He gave me authority over minor accounts, introduced me to the board, taught me how to navigate the politics. On paper, I was executive trainee. In reality, I was already the one keeping everything from falling apart. When the call came from Mr. Reeves's office, I almost didn't answer. The funeral had been 3 days earlier, and my mother was already making comments about next steps. Vanessa was busy curating a slideshow for social media. I just wanted quiet, but the lawyer's tone was firm, formal. "Amanda," he said, "your father's will needs to be read. Tuesday morning. Your presence is required." The day came faster than I expected. The law office sat on the top floor of a building overlooking the river. My father had loved that view, he said. Watching the cargo ships come and go reminded him why he worked so hard. Elaine and Vanessa arrived late, of course sweeping in with the scent of designer perfume and irritation. Vanessa wore sunglasses indoors as if morning was a photo op. Elaine dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and said, "We're just so devastated, you know. Mr. Reeves didn't bother responding. He was an old friend of my father's, the kind who believed in precision over patience." "Let's begin," he said. He unfolded a typed document, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. "To my wife, Elaine Collins," he began, "I leave the personal properties she already enjoys, along with a trust fund established for her comfort. To my eldest daughter, Vanessa, I leave my love and best wishes in her career pursuits." Elaine leaned back, smiling faintly, certain that more was coming. Then Reeves continued, "To my younger daughter Amanda, who stood by me not for gain but for loyalty, I leave Collins Maritime Group in its entirety, shares, assets, and full executive authority, as well as all remaining personal and business holdings. She has earned this through integrity and devotion. She is my true legacy." The air left the room. Vanessa's head snapped up, her sunglasses sliding down her nose. Elaine blinked like she'd misheard. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice tight. "There must be some mistake." Reeves shook his head. "Your husband was very clear. He updated this will 18 months ago, fully notarized, in sound mind and health." Vanessa shot to her feet. "That's ridiculous. Dad wouldn't do that. Amanda manipulated him. She took advantage of him being sick." Mr. Reeves didn't flinch. He anticipated that claim. He opened another folder and played a video on the screen. My father appeared sitting at his desk, his voice calm and steady. "If you're watching this," he said, "I'm gone. And if there's any dispute, let me be clear. Amanda knows this company better than anyone. She's earned every part of it. I've made this decision freely, with gratitude and peace." Elaine pressed a hand to her chest. "Charles, what were you thinking?" she whispered to no one. Vanessa turned away, muttering curses under her breath. I couldn't move. I just watched him, his eyes, his voice, the absolute certainty. It was the first time I felt both heartbroken and validated at once. When the video ended, Mr. Reeves looked at me. "Your father also left you a letter," he said. I opened it carefully, the paper shaking in my hands. "My dearest Amanda," it read, "you showed up when others didn't. You worked for love, not recognition. Remember what I taught you: truth doesn't need to shout. It stands quietly and still wins." I folded the letter and tucked it into my bag. Elaine stood smoothing her skirt, forcing a smile for the room. "Well," she said, her voice brittle, "we'll be speaking with our attorneys." She walked out without another glance at me. Vanessa followed, slamming the door behind her. That night, I sat in my old bedroom staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. My phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa: "Either you share or we fight. Your choice." An hour later, my mother knocked on my door. "Sweetheart," she began softly, the word tasting false. "You know your father wasn't thinking clearly. He was emotional. You and I could settle this privately. You keep a portion, I keep the rest. It's what's fair." "Fair," I repeated. "You mean convenient?" Her expression hardened. "Do you have any idea what people will say? You taking everything, it looks greedy, Amanda. It looks bad for the family." "I'm not the one who cares about appearances," I said quietly. "He made his choice." She sighed, then dropped the sweetness altogether. "You'll regret this." When she left, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there hearing my father's voice in my head. "If they ever come for what you've earned, don't fight them with anger. Fight them with facts." At midnight, I drove to the company headquarters. The building loomed against the skyline, its glass windows reflecting the city lights. Inside, it was quiet except for the hum of the security system. I walked into my father's old office, the one I'd avoided since the funeral. His chair was still turned toward the window, as if waiting for him to return. I sat down, slowly breathing in the faint smell of tobacco and ink. "You trusted me, Dad," I whispered. "I won't let them destroy what you built." I opened his computer, the one I'd helped him set up years ago, and started pulling files, contracts, board minutes, financial reports. Every detail mattered now. This wasn't just about money. It was about protecting a legacy. By dawn, the city was waking up outside the windows, cargo ships sliding down the river, horns echoing across the water. My phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. "Breaking: Collins family rift over maritime empire. Sources say, widow and eldest daughter to contest will in court." A photograph of Vanessa appeared on the screen, flawless and confident, declaring, "We're fighting for what's rightfully ours." I stared at her picture, exhaustion sharpening into resolve. "If it's war they want," I murmured, "they'll get it, but not the kind they expect." By the end of that week, my own family had turned me into a villain on national TV. Every channel played some version of the same story: greedy daughter steals family empire. Photos of me walking into the courthouse looking composed were plastered beside images of my mother wiping tears and Vanessa holding her hand. Commentators debated my morality like it was a sport. "She's too young to handle that company. Maybe the will was forged." What kind of daughter sues her own family? None of them knew that I wasn't the one who started this war. The headlines hit harder than I expected. At first, I tried to ignore them, but they bled into everything: calls from investors, messages from employees, even gossip among people I'd once called friends. My inbox overflowed with requests for comment. My assistant begged me to issue a statement. "No," I said. "Numbers will speak louder than gossip." But deep down, I knew this wasn't about the company. It was personal. My mother and sister weren't just protecting their pride. They wanted to erase me. Every morning, a new rumor appeared. One claimed I'd blackmailed my dying father. Another said I'd bribed the lawyer. I'd laugh if it didn't sting so much. The cruelest part was how believable it sounded to people who'd never met me, because that's the story Elaine and Vanessa had been writing my entire life. I was 12 when I first realized the rules were different for me. Vanessa was the golden girl, the one mother showed off at charity luncheons in matching dresses. I was the quiet one, left at home to help the staff. On my 13th birthday, Vanessa got a new car. I got a book about business ethics. My mother told me it was more your style. She said it like an insult. One Christmas, I overheard her on the phone with a friend laughing softly. "Amanda's sweet, but she doesn't have presence. She'll never lead anything." I sat on the stairs, hugging my knees, listening. That same night, my father found me there, eyes red from trying not to cry. "You don't need to be loud to be strong, Mandy," he said, kneeling in front of me. People will underestimate you. Let them. It gives you room to surprise them later. I carried that advice like armor. It got me through every insult, every eye roll, every time my mother introduced me as our quiet one like it was a flaw. Vanessa inherited mother's charm and her cruelty. I inherited dad's patience and his silence. But patience has a limit, and mine was starting to crack. When I saw my mother's face on TV a week later, I nearly dropped my coffee. She was sitting on a talk show set, perfectly styled voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. Charles was confused those last few months, she told the host. He wasn't himself. He adored Amanda, but he wasn't well. Vanessa joined remotely from Los Angeles, her voice tight with righteous anger. We're not fighting for money, she said. We're fighting for our father's true legacy. She even managed a tear. The next morning, the company's PR director called. Amanda, the board is concerned, he said carefully. Investors want reassurance. The public is sympathetic to your mother. Then we'll reassure them with performance reports, not sympathy, I said. Release the quarterly data. Let the numbers do the talking. He hesitated. They're threatening a full lawsuit. I sighed. Let them. But the truth was, the constant attacks were taking their toll. Every night I scrolled through headlines, I swore. I'd ignore reading comment sections filled with strangers, judging a story they didn't understand. People said I looked cold. Others called me calculated. No one called me what I actually was: tired. A few days later, my mother called out of nowhere. Dinner, she said curtly. At the old house. Just the family. Let's talk before this gets uglier. I should have known better, but something in me still wanted to believe there was a piece of her that meant it. That maybe she wanted peace. The house hadn't changed, same marble floors, same portraits of Vanessa smiling in ball gowns. I was the only one missing from the walls. My father's study door was shut, sealed like a tomb. When I walked into the dining room, they were already there. Vanessa poured herself wine without looking at me. Mother sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed. You're tearing this family apart, she began. No, I said quietly. You tore it apart years ago when you turned love into a transaction. Her lips thinned. You've always been dramatic. We're offering you a chance to fix this. Step down, let Vanessa take interim control, and we'll settle this privately. Vanessa leaned forward, smirking. You were nothing before Dad handed you that company. You think you earned it. You don't even know how to lead. I met her stare. He didn't hand it to me. He trained me. While you were busy posing for magazines, I was in board meetings. While you were selling the image of this family, I was keeping it from falling apart. Mother's expression hardened. Watch your tone. Why truth offends you. Her hand moved before I saw it coming. The slap echoed through the room. The kind of silence that follows violence filled the air, heavy, suffocating. My cheeks stung, but I didn't flinch. This, I said softly, is exactly why he chose me. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door. The rain outside had just started, soft at first, then heavier as I reached my car. I sat there trembling, not from pain, but from the final realization that whatever family I'd imagined was gone for good. At home, I went straight to the safe in my father's study. Inside were ledger's contracts and a stack of leather-bound journals. I hadn't opened them before. They felt too private. But now I needed answers. I sat on the floor and began reading. His handwriting was neat, deliberate. Vanessa avoids hard work. Elaine spends more than I earn. Only Amanda asks questions. My throat tightened. I turned the page. I worry I was a better boss than husband. Maybe that's why Elaine resents me. Maybe that's why Amanda reminds her of everything she failed to be. I closed the book and pressed it to my chest. He'd seen everything, the favoritism, the manipulation, and still tried to love them anyway. He didn't leave them out of the will to punish them. He did it to protect the company from them. From their carelessness, their greed, their need to perform instead of lead. Tears slid down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. For the first time, I didn't feel broken. I felt understood. When I finally looked up, dawn was peeking through the curtains. The world outside was quiet again. I placed the journal back in the safe, and locked it. That's when my phone buzzed. A news alert. Breaking: Vanessa Collins files official lawsuit against sister over Collins Maritime Group. Claims fraud and undue influence. The article included a quote from her press conference, "I'll expose the truth. My sister took advantage of a dying man." I set the phone down, a strange calm settling over me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I'd finally reached a place beyond anger. "They call it revenge," I whispered to the empty room. "I call it clarity." I walked to the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. For the first time, I said, "I see them for who they really are, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Just as I turned away, my email pinged. The subject line read, "From someone who worked with your father. He wanted you to know what he taught me before he died. Let's meet." I stared at the message, heartbeat quickening. Whoever it was, they knew something. Maybe this was what Dad meant by truth stands quietly. I closed my laptop, grabbed my coat, and took a deep breath. The storm outside was still raging, but for the first time in weeks I didn't feel afraid. If the past had been about surviving my family, the future would be about honoring the man who'd believed in me. And I was ready. The email came just past midnight, its subject line glowing through the rain-streaked window like a warning: "Your father wanted me to teach you one last thing. Meet me tomorrow noon, Pier 8. No signature, no attachments. Just that single line. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to feel hope or suspicion. My father had been gone for months, but somehow he was still finding ways to pull me forward. I reread it 3 times before calling Daniel, my attorney. "It could be a setup," he said, voice thick with exhaustion. "They're digging for anything to make you look unstable. Don't go alone." "I'll be fine," I told him. "If it's nothing, I'll walk away." "But if it's something..." "You really think he left breadcrumbs?" "I know he did," I said. "He never left anything to chance." By morning, the rain had eased into a gray drizzle. The city felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I drove toward the harbor, past rows of cargo cranes, rising like skeletons against the skyline. Pier 8 sat on the far end, half abandoned, smelling of diesel and salt. The kind of place my father always loved, real, unpolished, alive. A man waited near the edge, tall, gray-haired, wearing an old mariner's jacket. He turned as I approached, his face weathered but kind. "Amanda Collins," he said. "You look just like him." "Who are you?" "Graham Holt," he replied. "Your father's financial advisor and his friend. We worked together for 20 years. I hesitated. "You sent the email?" He nodded. "Your father asked me to. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd give you this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal drive sealed in plastic. Everything he didn't have time to say. I stared at it, the weight of it heavier than its size. "What's on it?" "Proof," he said simply. "And lessons." He gestured toward the benches along the pier. "He called you his silent apprentice." Did you know that my throat tightened? He used to say I learned best when I wasn't talking. Graham smiled faintly. He meant more than that. 2 years before he passed, he started something called the Leadership Shadow Program. Confidential. He wanted to teach you how to run the company without interference. He told me you'd think it was just helping him out. It wasn't. It was training. The wind whipped against us, scattering gulls overhead. I turned the drive in my hand, afraid to plug it in, afraid it would make everything real. "Why tell me now?" "Because your mother and sister are coming for you," Graham said. He knew they would. He left me instructions: wait until they file. Then, and only then, give her what she needs. What kind of instructions? The kind that win court cases. He handed me a folder from his bag. Inside were documents, board resolutions, emails, signed memos, dated months before my father's death. Transfer of authority, independent audit certification. Every page bore his signature. My eyes burned. He planned this. He prepared. Graham corrected. "There's a difference." He pulled out one last sheet of paper, handwritten. "He asked me to show you this in person." It was a letter, short and deliberate. "If you're reading this, Mandy, they've done exactly what I expected. Don't fight with emotion. Fight with evidence. Truth will always outlast noise. You don't need their approval, just your integrity. I looked up at Graham, my vision blurring. He knew me better than anyone. He believed in you, Graham said quietly. He saw the kind of leader you'd become. Not like them, loud and self-serving, but steady. Fair. You remind me of him when he was young, before success started weighing him down. I slipped the letter back into the folder, holding it to my chest. Thank you. There's more, he said. He left a message for you. A video. It's on that drive. But don't watch it here. Watch it somewhere safe. And Amanda? I looked up. Judge Raymond Burke, he said. Your father trusted him. Said if this ever reached court, Burke would recognize you not as a threat but as proof of his legacy. He told him about you years ago. The words hit like a wave. The way Judge Burke had stood up when he saw me, the shock in his eyes, it suddenly made sense. He'd known who I was before I even spoke. I'll use this, I said, gripping the folder. Every page, every line. I'll clear his name and mine. That's what he wanted, Graham said, pulling his coat tighter as the wind picked up. He said the truth would find its way through you. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at my father's old desk, plugged the drive into his computer, and waited. The screen flickered before his face appeared tired, older, but still sharp. If you're seeing this, he began, I'm gone. I won't pretend that doesn't break my heart. But I need you to know I trusted you with everything. You're my eyes now, my voice. If they question you, remember they questioned me too once. The difference is I had time to prove them wrong. You will too. He smiled, small and proud. You always listened even when no one else did. That's your gift, Mandy. Use it. Don't shout your truth, demonstrate it. I didn't realize I was crying until I saw the tear hit the keyboard. His voice faded, replaced by a black screen with one final line typed across it. Show up. That's all I ever needed from you. The next morning, I walked into the office earlier than anyone. The place smelled like coffee and rain. I stood in the hallway looking through the glass wall at the company logo, my father's name, still etched in gold. Collins Maritime Group. Flashbacks came in waves. Nights spent in the shipyard watching dock workers load cargo under floodlights. Early mornings reviewing contracts while my friends still slept. He never treated me like a child but like a colleague in training. Leadership isn't about talking, he used to say. It's about showing up when everyone else disappears. I remembered the night we discovered the insurance fraud. The CFO had been diverting funds from the employee health plan. I wanted to go to the press. He stopped me. We fix it quietly, he'd said. We protect the innocent, not punish the guilty in public. That's justice, not revenge. Together we replaced the stolen money from his own account and fired the man with severance so he could keep his family afloat. I'd been angry back then. Now I understood. Integrity wasn't about victory. It was about mercy. He'd written in one of his journals later that week, "She's ready." The words came back to me now, glowing in memory like they were written just for this moment. By noon I called Graham again. "One more thing," I said. "Did he ever tell you why he chose me over them?" He chuckled softly. He said, "Because you understood the value of silence." I hung up, staring at the USB drive still on my desk. The rain had stopped outside, the sun fighting to break through the clouds. I felt calm for the first time in months. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "They filed the motion this morning. Court date confirmed next Friday." I exhaled slowly. So it was official. The lawsuit was moving forward. I picked up the drive, weighing it in my hand, and smiled through the ache. "You wanted me to lead, Dad," I whispered. "So I will." I walked to the window, looking out at the harbor ships, cutting through the water like purpose itself. The same pier where he'd started his empire shimmered in the distance under the pale sunlight. My reflection in the glass looked older, sharper, more certain. I wasn't the quiet daughter anymore. I was the CEO of Collins Maritime Group and the woman my father had built me to become. The phone buzzed again. A final text from Graham. Everything you need is already inside you, and on that drive. I clenched it in my fist, the edges pressing into my palm. Let's finish what he started, I murmured. Outside, thunder rolled far off the coast, soft but steady, like applause from somewhere beyond. The storm was coming again, but this time I was ready to meet it head-on. The morning of the trial began with an eerie calm. The city was still half asleep, wrapped in fog that drifted in from the harbor. I stood by the window, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the skyline reflected in the gray water. The same ships my father once oversaw were already leaving port horns echoing faintly across the bay. You taught me how to fight quietly, Dad, I whispered. Now it's time they finally hear the truth loud and clear. By the time I reached the courthouse, the fog had lifted, and so had the city's silence. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping. Miss Collins, how does it feel to be sued by your own mother? Do you regret not settling privately? Is it true you forged your father's signature? I kept walking. The air snapped with the sound of shutters and shouted questions. My mother and sister had arrived minutes earlier, stepping out of a black limousine like celebrities attending a premiere. Elaine's hand trembled gracefully as she dabbed a tear. Vanessa wore all white, the picture of innocence. When one reporter asked for a comment, my mother turned toward the cameras and said, "We're just here for justice. Justice." That word didn't mean the same thing to her as it did to me. Daniel, my attorney, leaned close. "They're going to play emotion. You stick with facts, always," I said. We entered through a side door away from the chaos. Inside, the courthouse smelled like old wood and varnished, the same courtroom where my father once testified in a corruption case years ago. It felt almost poetic, his daughter now, fighting her own battle for integrity in the same room. Judge Raymond Burke presided, his expression unreadable but calm. When he saw me, there was a faint flicker of recognition, a subtle nod that said he remembered our last meeting. I'd felt that same steadiness from him before, the quiet respect of someone who valued truth more than theatrics. The bailiff called the case. Estate of Charles Collins versus Amanda Collins. Hearing it aloud hit differently. My own name on trial against my family's. The plaintiff's attorney, Richard Halpern, rose first. He was everything you'd expect from a lawyer who thrived on spectacled tan-skinned silver cufflinks, a voice built for headlines. "Your Honor," he began, "this case isn't about greed. It's about love misplaced, manipulated, and tragically abused." He let that last word hang in the air before pacing slowly. My clients, Mrs. Elaine Collins and her eldest daughter Vanessa, were blindsided by a will that defies reason. They cared deeply for Mr. Collins. They visited him regularly, supported him through illness, only to find that his estate, his company, was left entirely to his younger daughter Amanda. A daughter who isolated him, influenced him, and exploited his vulnerability. He turned toward me. "We intend to prove undue influence through pattern and opportunity." Miss Collins placed herself between her father and everyone else. She managed his communications, controlled his medications, and convinced him that his own wife and eldest child were his enemies. A murmur spread through the gallery. I didn't move. Daniel leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. "He's performing," he whispered. "Let him." When Halpern finished, he placed a hand on Elaine's shoulder like he was guiding a grieving widow through tragedy. Theatrical. Calculated. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood without a hint of showmanship. "Your Honor, this case is about greed, but not my clients. The evidence will show that Charles Collins made his decisions intentionally, with full mental capacity based on a lifetime of observation. My client didn't manipulate him, she earned his trust. She earned the company he built, not through deceit, but through consistency, integrity, and presence." He opened a folder and placed several documents on the bench. You'll see board resolutions transferring authority 6 months before his death, independent audit reports verifying all transactions, and most importantly, you'll hear directly from Mr. Collins himself. The courtroom buzzed. Halpern frowned. Daniel pressed play on a short video. My father appeared on the screen, seated at his desk, looking tired but clear-eyed. "I've updated my will to reflect the reality of my family," he said, voice steady. "Amanda has shown dedication, discipline, and honor. She has earned the right to continue my work. This is my choice, and mine alone." My mother's sharp inhale echoed in the silence. Vanessa grabbed her hand dramatically, whispering something that looked rehearsed. Halpern jumped to his feet. "Objection irrelevant and prejudicial." Judge Burke didn't hesitate. "Overruled. It goes to intent." Daniel smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt a surge of quiet triumph. For the first time, the courtroom had heard his voice, the real voice, not the one they'd twisted in interviews. Halpern spent the rest of the morning trying to discredit the documents. He accused the notary of bias, the auditor of inconsistency, even implied my father might have been tricked into signing. Each claim collapsed under paperwork, dates, signatures, witnesses. Daniel countered every move with surgical precision. By noon, Judge Burke called for recess. My mother avoided eye contact as she left the stand, her posture crumbling slightly under the weight of exposure. Vanessa kept her chin high, but I saw her hands shaking. In the hallway, the press waited like wolves. I ignored them, walking straight past until Daniel caught up. "You did good," he said, calm, composed, unreadable. "Exactly what your father would have done." I nodded, forcing a smile. "That's the easy part. The hard part is what comes next." He frowned. "You're expecting something." "I know them," I said. "They don't fight fair. There's always something next." I was right. Halfway through lunch, Daniel's phone buzzed. He stepped aside to answer, and when he came back, his expression had shifted. "They've filed a secondary claim." What he exhaled. "Corporate fraud. They're accusing you of falsifying company records to cover financial misconduct. They want an emergency injunction to freeze your CEO powers until the case is over." I froze. "So they're not just trying to take the inheritance, they're trying to take the company now." Daniel nodded grimly. "If they succeed, a court-appointed trustee will run Collins Maritime until the verdict." Outside the restaurant window, the stock ticker flashed across a digital billboard. Our company's name flickered in red, shares dropping fast. Investors were reacting to the headlines already spreading online. I pushed my plate away. "They're not fighting for justice, they're fighting for control." Daniel leaned forward. "Then we show them what real control looks like. We fight with facts, not panic." He handed me a tablet. On the screen was a schedule. "Tomorrow they're calling your mother as the first witness. Expect tears, guilt, the whole performance." "Let her perform," I said. "I have truth on my side." We returned to the courthouse later that afternoon for the judge's ruling on the motion. Halpern argued passionately that I was destabilizing the company through reckless leadership. He produced half-baked reports, unverified claims, and quotes from anonymous employees. Daniel responded calmly, presenting verified audits, emails from the board, and even a recent statement from Graham, confirming my father's leadership transfer. When Judge Burke finally spoke, his tone was firm. "The motion to suspend Miss Collins's authority is denied. The evidence of fraud is insufficient and speculative." Halpern's face drained of color. Elaine slumped. Vanessa glared at me like I'd committed a personal crime by winning. I wanted to look at the judge to thank him silently, but I didn't. I stayed composed just like Dad taught me. When court adjourned for the day, the hallway erupted again with noise and flashes. Reporters pushed microphones toward me, shouting questions. I stopped for just a moment, enough to make sure my voice carried. "This isn't about revenge," I said evenly. "It's about protecting what's right." Then I walked to the car where Daniel was waiting. He shut the door behind me as the cameras flashed. "You handled that perfectly," he said. I leaned back against the seat, exhaustion washing over me. What's next tomorrow? Your mother takes the stand, he said. It's going to get ugly. I looked out the window at the courthouse, glowing gold in the setting Sunday. Good, I said softly. It's time she finally tells the world who she really is. The driver pulled away from the curb, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a quiet smile. They thought they were fighting for money. I was fighting for something else entirely. They wanted control. I wanted justice. And justice always comes with a price I was more than willing to pay. The courtroom felt colder that morning. Maybe it was the air conditioning. Maybe it was nerves. Or maybe it was the way my mother avoided looking at me as she took the witness stand. Her black suit was immaculate, the kind of polished elegance she wore like armor. She clutched a silk handkerchief in one hand, a symbol for sympathy. When she sat down, the bailiff swore her in, and Judge Burke gave a single nod. Mrs. Collins, you may begin. I sat still at the defense table, my palms flat against the cool wood. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter she could control. I was the woman she had to answer to. Her lawyer, Halpern, stood like a proud director, preparing for the opening act. Mrs. Collins, he began softly, could you describe your relationship with your late husband, Elaine? Took a shaky breath, just loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Charles and I had a wonderful marriage. We were partners in every sense. I supported him through his career, his illnesses, everything. She dabbed at her eyes, until Amanda started changing things. Changing things how she isolated him, she said, voice trembling perfectly. She told him I was a distraction, that I cared only for money. She made it impossible for me to visit him during his last months. He started refusing my calls. My own husband. Her voice cracked on cue. I could almost admire her performance, if it hadn't been so cruel. She looked fragile, tragic, exactly the way she wanted the world to see her. Halpern paced slowly, letting silence do the work. So you're saying your daughter turned your husband against you? Yes, she whispered. She poisoned his mind. He wasn't himself. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled. I felt Daniel shift beside me, his pen tapping against his notepad. We'd both seen this play before. Elaine Collins was a master manipulator, and now she had an audience. When Halpern finally stepped back, he gave her a reassuring smile. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Burke nodded. Mr. Goldstein, your witness. Daniel rose, calmly buttoning his jacket. Mrs. Collins, he began, you said. Amanda isolated your husband. Do you have any records of being denied visitation? She blinked. No, but she controlled his schedule. So no written requests, no emails, no messages, asking to visit Elaine shifted in her chair. I didn't keep track. I was grieving. I understand, Daniel said evenly. But grief doesn't erase evidence. Let's look at this. He lifted a folder and handed it to the clerk. These are the hospital logs from your husband's final months. According to these records, you visited 3 times in 6 months. Is that correct? Her jaw tightened. I was busy managing affairs. Affairs, Daniel repeated. Would those include the monthly bank transfers your husband sent you? Halpern immediately rose. Objection irrelevant, overruled Judge Burke said. Proceed. Daniel moved closer, his voice steady but firm. Mrs. Collins, I have here a series of emails from you to your husband. One reads, Charles, I need another transfer before month's end. Another says, Vanessa's business needs your help again. Do you deny sending these? Elaine's hand trembled slightly. He wanted to provide for us. And he did, Daniel said. Between 2010 and 2022, your husband transferred over $900,000 to your accounts. Does that sound correct? She looked to Halpern for help. He avoided her gaze. I don't remember the exact amount, she muttered. Daniel nodded. Fair enough. But it's documented. Now, during that same period, my client Amanda was managing your husband's company's operations without salary. So while she was earning nothing, you were receiving almost $1 million. Does that seem balanced to you? Halpern jumped in again. Objection argumentative. Sustained, said the judge. Daniel didn't miss a beat. No further questions on finances, Your Honor. Let's move on to family involvement. You claimed Amanda isolated your husband. But according to his phone logs, he called you 15 times in the last year of his life. You returned only 2 of those calls. Why? Elaine's lips parted but no words came out. Daniel waited, then leaned slightly closer. Was it because you were busy, or because you didn't want to hear what he had to say? Stop twisting things, she snapped, suddenly her voice echoing across the courtroom. Mrs. Collins, the judge warned, control yourself. She swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes, but not the kind that won sympathy this time. The room was dead quiet. Daniel spoke softly. You loved your husband, didn't you? Of course I did. Then why were you absent from his final will reading? Why didn't you stay at the hospital when he was dying? Her face flushed. Because he didn't want me there. So he chose distance, not Amanda. Elaine froze. Daniel straightened his papers. No further questions. The judge nodded, but Elaine wasn't done. She turned toward me, her composure slipping. You think you're better than me, don't you? You think because he gave you that company you're some kind of saint. You were always his favorite. He forgot about me. Her voice cracked raw and furious. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Halpern looked horrified. Daniel said quietly, So this isn't about undue influence, is it, Mrs. Collins? It's about jealousy. Objection. Halpern barked, but the damage was done. Elaine's breathing came fast and shallow. He left me with nothing after everything I did for him. You took him away from me. Judge Burke leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp. Mrs. Collins, please step down. She hesitated, eyes darting between me and Vanessa. Finally she rose, gripping the handrail for balance. As she turned, she whispered, barely audible but still caught by the microphone, She doesn't even know what Vanessa did. The words dropped like glass breaking. Halpern's head snapped toward her. Elaine. The judge's gavel slammed once. Order, Mrs. Collins, what did you say? Elaine froze, realizing too late that everyone had heard. The entire courtroom hummed with shock. I stared at her, heart pounding. What did Vanessa do? I asked quietly. She looked at me, eyes wide and wild, but said nothing. Judge Burke cleared his throat. We'll address that tomorrow. Mrs. Collins, you may step down. Halpern helped her off the stand, whispering furiously. The spectators murmured until the gavel came down again. Court adjourned a few minutes later. As I gathered my notes, Daniel leaned close. That wasn't an act, he said. She slipped. Whatever Vanessa did, I murmured, it's something big. Outside, the sky had turned gray, rain beginning to fall in slow, deliberate drops. The press was waiting again, shouting questions, but their words felt far away, muffled under the sound of thunder. I climbed into the car and shut the door, finally letting out the breath I'd been holding all morning. Daniel slid in beside me, wiping rain off his glasses. That was a turning point, he said quietly. The judge saw right through her. She saw through herself, I replied. We sat in silence for a moment, the rain tapping against the windshield. Across the street, I saw my mother being led into her car by Vanessa, her hand trembling as she gripped her daughter's arm. For the first time, she looked small. They tried to paint me as the manipulator, I said, softly staring through the glass. But the truth doesn't need makeup. It shows itself when the lies collapse. Daniel looked at me. Tomorrow's going to be rough. Vanessa's up next? I nodded slowly. Good. It's time I hear what she's been hiding. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, the rain grew heavier, blurring the city into streaks of gray and gold. I leaned my head against the window, my reflection staring back at me, tired, resolute, unbroken. They thought the worst was over. They were wrong. Tomorrow my sister would take the stand. And if what my mother said was true, I was about to find out just how deep their betrayal really went. The courthouse was packed the next morning. Word had spread fast. Elaine's slip from the day before had made headlines. Family feud deepens. What did the sister do? Every seat in the gallery was filled. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the press waited outside like vultures. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with anticipation. Vanessa walked in behind Halpern, head high but jaw tight. Her black heels clicked sharply against the tile floor. She looked every bit the composed professional she wanted to appear. Pearl earrings, tailored beige suit hair pinned flawlessly. But when our eyes met, I saw it. The faint tremor at the corner of her mouth. Fear disguised as confidence. Judge Burke entered, took his seat, and nodded at Halpern. "Call your next witness." "The plaintiff's call, Miss Vanessa Collins." Vanessa adjusted her blazer and made her way to the stand. The oath barely left the bailiff's lips before she began her performance. "Miss Collins," Halpern said in a soft, almost sympathetic tone, "can you describe your relationship with your father?" Vanessa smiled, practiced and brittle. "My father was everything to me. He inspired me to work hard, to dream big. But after Amanda started working with him, things changed. She took over every aspect of his life. Calls went unanswered. Visits were canceled. She even had his assistants block my number." A few people in the gallery gasped. Elaine, sitting at the front, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, the picture of maternal pain. Halpern nodded solemnly. "And how did that make you feel?" Vanessa lowered her gaze. "It broke my heart. I just wanted to be part of his world again, but she gestured toward me, made sure I wasn't. Theatrics, pure polished, rehearsed. I'd seen it before. She'd been performing since childhood, always the perfect daughter, the social favorite. I kept my eyes on her but said nothing." Halpern stepped back. "Your Honor, this testimony will show the pattern of manipulation that defines this case." Judge Burke scribbled something on his notes but didn't react. "Proceed." Halpern smiled reassuringly at Vanessa. "Take your time, Miss Collins. What do you believe motivated your sister's actions?" Vanessa hesitated for half a beat, then said power. She wanted control of Dad's company and the money that came with it. She knew how much I meant to him and she couldn't stand it, so she made him believe I was irresponsible, that I didn't care. Her voice wavered perfectly on cue. I heard someone sniffle behind me. Halpern looked pleased. No further questions. He turned toward Daniel, who was already standing, his expression calm and precise. "Miss Collins," Daniel began evenly, "you testified that Amanda denied you access to company reports. Did you ever work for Collins?" Maritime Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "No, but I was involved in several projects." "Were you ever on the payroll?" "No, but Dad trusted me with certain responsibilities." "Like what?" She hesitated. "Event planning, public relations. Small things." Daniel nodded. "And were those responsibilities compensated?" "No, I did them out of love for the company." "Out of love," Daniel repeated, walking toward the bench. "Then perhaps you can explain these." He held up a stack of papers. "Corporate credit card statements. Purchases made under your name, luxury handbags, jewelry, first-class flights, hotel stays in Paris and Dubai." Halpern stood. "Objection. We haven't seen those documents. They were disclosed in discovery," Daniel replied. Page 52 through 67. Judge Burke flipped through his copy, nodded. "Overruled. Continue." Daniel approached the witness stand and placed one of the pages before Vanessa. "These transactions were made using a corporate account card tied to your login credentials." "Care to explain?" Vanessa's lips parted. "That's not mine." "Really?" "Because the receipts were emailed to your personal address, the same one you used for social media, the same one you used to apply for a loan 3 years ago." Elaine stiffened in her seat. The gallery began to murmur. Daniel didn't let up. "Did your father authorize these purchases?" He knew about them." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "He did not. We have his written expense authorizations, none mention you. In fact, these purchases continued after his hospitalization." "Would you like to see the dates?" Vanessa looked at Halpern, her face paling. "This isn't fair. I'm not on trial." Daniel's tone stayed soft but merciless. "No, but your credibility is." He paused, then added, Would it surprise you to learn that your boyfriend Jason Cooper was also reimbursed through the same account? Elaine gasped audibly this time. Daniel projected a copy of the wire transfer on the screen. $10,000 to J. Cooper Consulting, an entity that doesn't exist in any state registry. Did your father approve this payment? Vanessa's eyes darted around. He wanted to help Jason's startup, which filed bankruptcy 6 weeks later, Daniel said. And yet the funds never reached the company's account. They went straight into a joint checking account held by you and Mr. Cooper. Shall I display that too? Objection, Halpern barked. This is irrelevant, Judge Burke. Leaned back voice cool. Overruled. It's entirely relevant to credibility and motive. Continue, Mr. Goldstein. Vanessa's composure cracked. You don't understand, he gave me permission. He said he'd rather see me use it than some stranger. Daniel's tone softened, almost pitying. Miss Collins, your father trusted people. That trust built his company. You exploited it. Isn't that true? Vanessa's hands shook. No, I didn't. He took one step closer. Then tell us why you needed access to company funds if you weren't an employee. Silence. Or why you told your mother those charges were from business trips when they were luxury vacations. Tears welled in her eyes. Stop it. You testified that Amanda manipulated your father. But according to this record, you were the one siphoning his money while he was dying. Her voice rose into a sob. You think she's perfect. You all do. She stole everything, his attention, his love, his company. I just wanted something too, Amanda, she shouted, looking straight at me. You took him from me. I felt every eye in the room shift to me. I met her gaze and spoke evenly. No, Vanessa. He gave me what you never wanted to earn. Elaine stood abruptly. Stop it, both of you. The courtroom erupted, voices, whispers, the sound of reporters typing furiously. Judge Burke slammed his gavel. Order! Order in the court! When silence finally returned, Vanessa had her face buried in her hands. Elaine looked like she might faint. Halpern whispered something to his client, but even he knew the damage was irreversible. Judge Burke exhaled slowly. Miss Collins, I strongly advise you to compose yourself. This is not a place for theatrics. He turned to Daniel. Mr. Goldstein, you may wrap up. Daniel nodded. One last question. Miss Collins, do you have any documentation, any email message or recording to support your claim that your father approved your use of company funds? She shook her head weakly. No. Then no further questions, Your Honor. The judge looked down at Vanessa. You may step down. She stumbled off the stand, her mother reaching out to steady her. Vanessa pulled away. The two of them sat apart for the rest of the afternoon, both looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. When the judge called recess, Daniel leaned close. We just turned the tide. I watched Vanessa, sitting with her head bowed, her pearl earrings glinting under the fluorescent lights. No, I said quietly. We just uncovered the real storm. Outside, the reporters were already shouting questions, flashes going off in the rain. I ignored them and followed Daniel into a quiet hallway. He looked at me, eyes steady. Tomorrow we call our final witness Graham Holt. The name hit like a pulse of calm. Dad's last message, I said softly. It's time. Daniel nodded. Tomorrow we finish this. I turned toward the courthouse doors where the storm clouds pressed against the glass. My reflection stared back, exhausted but unwavering. They built their case on lies, I murmured. I built mine on truth. Outside, thunder rumbled low and distant, as if the world itself was waiting for what came next. Tomorrow the truth would finally speak for itself. When the bailiff called the court to order that morning, the silence was absolute. No one moved, no one whispered. Everyone knew this was it, the final witness, the moment that would decide everything. Judge Burke adjusted his glasses, his voice steady. The defense may call its next witness. Daniel rose. The defense calls Mr. Graham Holt. The old man walked with slow, deliberate steps, his gray coat neatly pressed, his expression calm but resolute. I hadn't seen him since the day at the pier, but his presence alone brought a strange sense of peace. He nodded to me briefly before taking the stand. "State your name and occupation for the record," Daniel said. "Graham Holt." "I was Mr. Charles Collins's financial advisor for over 20 years, he replied. His voice carried quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "Mr. Holt, can you describe your relationship with Mr. Collins during the last years of his life?" Graham clasped his hands. "We met weekly. Even after his retirement, he remained active in the business. He was sharp, methodical, and in full control of his faculties until the very end." Halpern stood abruptly. "Objection speculative," overruled Judge Burke said. "The witness worked directly with Mr. Collins." "Continue." Graham nodded. "Charles Collins was the most lucid man I've ever known. 2 years before his death, he revised his will and created a transition plan for his company. I was present for both. He was precise about his intentions." "And what were those intentions?" Daniel asked. "That his daughter Amanda Collins inherit full ownership and authority of Collins Maritime Group." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Elaine shook her head violently. "That's not true." He wasn't thinking clearly. Graham turned toward her, his expression soft but firm. "He knew exactly what he was doing, Mrs. Collins. He anticipated this very moment." Halpern approached for cross-examination, tone-dripping skepticism. "Mr. Holt, you're telling us a dying man grieving made perfect legal decisions without influence?" "Yes," Graham replied simply, "and he documented every one of them." He reached into a leather folder and handed Daniel a sealed envelope. "He left this with me along with a message to be shown in court if his will was ever challenged." Daniel opened it carefully, revealing a flash drive and several notarized forms. "What are these?" "His final testimony," Graham said. "A video recording, signed competency evaluation, and the notarized amendment to his estate plan." Judge Burke leaned forward. "Play the video." The lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life, and there he was, my father, Charles Collins. His face older, thinner, but the eyes still held that same steel-gray focus I'd grown up with. "If you're seeing this," he began, "it means they've done exactly what I expected." His voice filled the courtroom, steady and calm. "I want this on record. I was not coerced. I was not manipulated. I made my decisions freely." Elaine's breath caught. He continued, "I know my wife and eldest daughter believe they're entitled to my estate. They'll call this betrayal. But love without action is just noise. For 30 years, Amanda showed up. She worked beside me. She listened. She cared about this company when no one else did. This isn't punishment. It's consequence." The room was so still that even the hum of the projector seemed deafening. He smiled faintly, eyes softening. "Amanda, if you're watching this, I'm proud of you. You never asked for anything. You earned everything. Keep the company honest. Keep yourself honest. That's all I ever wanted." He reached forward and signed the document on screen. "This is my final will and statement. I leave Collins Maritime Group and all associated assets to Amanda Collins. My wish is final." The video ended. The silence stretched until Judge Burke cleared his throat, his voice low. "Court will take a moment to absorb the evidence." Elaine covered her face, crying quietly. Vanessa stared at the floor, motionless. I sat frozen, watching the blank screen, my chest so tight it hurt to breathe. Hearing his voice again, it felt like he'd stepped out of the grave just long enough to stand beside me. Halpern scrambled for footing. This could have been edited. Daniel was ready. It was authenticated by 2 digital forensic experts, verified by metadata, and witnessed by Mr. Holt and the estate's notary. Every frame matches the day and location of the recording. Judge Burke nodded. "Objection denied." Halpern sank into his seat. Elaine whispered, "He hated me." I turned toward her, voice quiet. "No, Mom, he just stopped pretending he didn't know who you really were." Her head snapped up, eyes red and wild. "You think this is justice. You destroyed this family." I shook my head. "I didn't destroy it. I just stopped letting you rewrite it." Vanessa finally spoke, her voice trembling. "He was supposed to love us too. I looked at her, not angry anymore, just tired. He did. You just never showed him why he should trust you. The courtroom fell silent again. Graham remained on the stand, composed like a man who had just fulfilled a lifelong promise. Daniel thanked him quietly. No further questions. Judge Burke leaned forward, his voice soft but authoritative. Mr. Holt, you may step down. And for the record, this court accepts the submitted evidence as valid and binding. When Graham left the stand, he passed me and gave a small nod. I mouthed, "Thank you." He simply smiled. The judge reviewed his notes for a long moment before speaking. This case has been painful to witness. Families should be a place of refuge, not warfare. But the law is clear. The will of Charles Collins stands as written. All claims by the plaintiffs are dismissed with prejudice. The sound of the gavel echoed through the chamber like thunder. Elaine slumped in her chair, sobbing. Vanessa sat beside her, hands limp in her lap, mascara streaking down her face. Daniel exhaled softly beside me. It's over, he said. I stared straight ahead. No, it's finished, but it'll never be over. Judge Burke left the bench. People began to file out, whispering, gathering their belongings, wiping eyes. I remained seated, the words of my father looping in my mind. You earned this. You showed up. When I finally stood, I turned toward my mother and sister. They both looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a rival but as a stranger they'd already lost. I walked past them without a word. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the air was cool, the sky pale blue. Cameras flashed from every direction, reporters shouting questions, but I didn't stop. I only said, my father built this company on truth. That's how I'll honor him. Daniel guided me through the crowd toward the waiting car. As we reached the steps, I looked back once. The courthouse loomed behind me, tall and solemn. Inside somewhere, his voice still echoed in my mind. Keep the company honest. Keep yourself honest. That night, I sat alone in my father's office, the same one where he'd filmed the video. The light was soft, the city quiet outside. I plugged the flash drive into the computer again, replaying the last seconds of his message. He smiled faintly into the camera. You earned this, Mandy. Through love, through presence, through truth. I closed my eyes, tears slipping silently down my face. He wasn't here to see me win, but somehow I knew he'd always intended for me to survive this moment, not to feel victorious, but to feel free. The screen went dark, and for a long time I sat there listening to the faint hum of the computer, to the echo of his voice still alive in the room. It wasn't victory. It was closure. The kind my father had been teaching me all my life. And as the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I whispered back to him, I'll keep my promise, Dad. I'll make it worth everything you gave me. Then I turned off the screen. The storm was finally over. The morning after the verdict, the world outside my window felt too quiet, like the city itself was holding its breath. The newspaper lay on my doorstep, its headlines stretched across the front page in bold type, Amanda Collins wins inheritance, battle family fractures and courtroom drama. Underneath, a photo of me walking out of the courthouse, head down, rain falling across my face. They made it look like victory. It didn't feel like one. When I arrived at Collins Maritime that morning, reporters swarmed the front gate. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward my face, voices shouting questions that blurred together. Do you feel vindicated? What will happen to your mother and sister? Is this justice or revenge? I paused only once, long enough for their noise to fade beneath my own heartbeat. Justice isn't about winning, I said quietly. It's about honoring what's right. Then I walked inside. The lobby smelled like salt and coffee, familiar and grounding. Employees stood in small clusters, whispering. Some looked at me with relief, others with uncertainty. The company had survived the trial, but trust, that fragile, invisible thing, was gone. By noon, I called an all-hands meeting in the main conference hall. The room was packed, hundreds of faces, some loyal, some skeptical. I took a deep breath and began. We've survived the storm, I said, my voice steady though my hands trembled behind the podium. But survival isn't enough. My father built this company on integrity, and somewhere along the way that got lost. We're not going back to that. Not ever again. There was a pause before I continued. This isn't about profits or pride. It's about rebuilding something honest. So if you're here for quick gains, there's the door. But if you're here to restore what this company stood for, then let's get to work. The room stayed quiet for a long time, and then someone began clapping. It spread slowly, unevenly at first, then stronger, until the entire room was filled with applause. After the meeting, I called the head of accounting to my office. Effective immediately, I said, replace the CFO. I want every transaction reviewed, every record audited. We start clean, he hesitated. That'll mean long hours. I'm aware, I said. My father didn't build this empire in comfort. Neither will we. By the end of the week, the structure began to shift. The toxic remnants of Vanessa's influence were removed. A retired port captain named Harris, a man who'd worked under my father for decades, was reinstated as operations head. When he walked into my office weathered and strong as ever, he shook his head and smiled. You look just like him, he said. I hope I lead like him, I replied. He chuckled. He'd be proud. But don't lead like him, Amanda. Lead like you. The sea changes. Captains have to change too. That night, as the last light faded over the harbor, Graham came by with a brown envelope in hand. He wanted you to have this once the case was over, he said. My pulse quickened. It's from him, he nodded. The final one. I waited until I was alone before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady, familiar, the kind of script that carried authority even in silence. My girl, it began. If you're reading this, then you've done what I expected. You stood your ground. I hope it never felt like a fight for money, because it never was. This was about truth. And you proved that. I blinked back tears, reading each line carefully. But victory without grace becomes another form of loss. Don't let their failure define your peace. Forgive without forgetting. Not for them, for you. Let go of the poison. Keep only what's worth keeping. My throat tightened. Build something worth more than money. Build trust. Build legacy. Build the kind of truth that lasts beyond you. I folded the letter slowly, pressing my palm over it. For the first time since he died, I didn't feel the weight of absence. I felt his presence, steady, guiding, still teaching me. When I looked up, Graham was still waiting in the doorway, hat in hand. He always knew what you'd need before you did, he said gently. He really did, I whispered. And you kept your promise. He smiled faintly. He trusted me to. And he trusted you to finish the story. Over the next week, the media frenzy began to fade. Elaine and Vanessa disappeared from public view. The press said Elaine sold the estate and moved out of the city. Vanessa, from what I heard, left the country entirely. There were rumors of debt, of bankruptcy, of scandals I didn't care to confirm. Daniel called one morning. They dropped their appeal, he said. No more court dates. It's officially over. Over, I repeated, though it felt strange on my tongue. That afternoon, an envelope arrived at my office without a return address. Inside was a single note written in elegant cursive. You were right about him. I wasn't strong enough to love the way he did. Elaine. I read it once, then set it in the drawer beside my father's letter. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. Some things didn't need answers. That evening I drove to the pier. The water shimmered beneath a fading orange sky. The same dock where my father taught me to steer, where he'd told me, every storm passes, but it's what you build after that counts. I stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at my hair, and said quietly, Rest now, Dad. I've got this. 2 weeks later, I called Daniel and Graham into the boardroom. On the table lay a stack of documents stamped the Collins Foundation for Maritime Families. This will be our first major initiative, I said. Scholarships for children of dock workers. Funding for seafarer safety. The people who kept this company alive for decades deserve more than a paycheck. Graham smiled, eyes glistening. He'd be proud, Amanda. Daniel nodded. This is exactly how he'd want you to lead. I looked out the window at the harbor, the cranes outlined against the sunset. He didn't build this for power, I said softly. He built it so people could stand taller. I'm just keeping the promise. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind. The office was quiet except for the hum of the sea beyond the glass. The city lights flickered to life one by one like stars finding their place. The city had finally stopped talking about the trial, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the noise. 1 month had passed since the verdict, and every morning I still woke before sunrise, standing by the window of my penthouse overlooking the harbor. The ships moved in slow rhythm, just like they did when my father was alive. For years I'd watched them with him, each one carrying something valuable, something fragile. He used to say people were the same way. We all carry cargo, Mandy, he'd tell me. The trick is keeping it afloat. Now I was the one steering the ship. The papers didn't let me forget it. Amanda Collins Harris, or heroine, can she save her father's legacy? The headlines alternated between admiration and doubt. I didn't care about either. I just wanted to run the company the way he taught me, honestly. When I arrived at the Collins Maritime headquarters that morning, the lobby buzzed with new life. Employees greeted me carefully, a mix of respect and caution. I couldn't blame them. They'd seen too many CEOs rise and fall in scandal. Trust had to be earned back, not demanded. Inside the boardroom, the air smelled of coffee and tension. The first shareholder meeting since the trial was about to begin. I looked around the long table, faces old and new, some familiar allies, some skeptics who'd sided quietly with Elaine and Vanessa before. One man cleared his throat. Miss Collins, congratulations on your legal victory. But courtroom wins don't always translate to boardroom success. I smiled politely. I'm aware. A woman in her 50s, leaned forward. The company's reputation took a hit. Investors are nervous. What exactly is your plan to fix that? I clicked the remote, and the projector lit up with slides: restructuring plans, transparency audits, employee benefit expansions. We rebuild, I said simply. Not just our profits, but our integrity. My father believed numbers mean nothing without the people who earn them, so we start there. Someone scoffed under his breath. I met his eyes. I didn't win a trial, I said evenly. I defended a principle, and that's how I'll run this company. The room went quiet. For the first time since my father's death, I felt his steadiness in my own voice. After the meeting, as people filed out, a gray-haired investor, one of my father's oldest partners, lingered behind. He stopped at the door and said softly, "He'd have approved, you know." It took me a second to answer. "I hope so," he smiled. "You don't need to hope. You're already proving it." When he left, I let out the breath I'd been holding. The fear, the pressure, it didn't vanish, but it began to loosen its grip. That afternoon, Graham arrived at my office carrying a small envelope. "He wanted you to have this once the case was over," he said. My throat tightened as I took it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Strong, deliberate, unmistakably his. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single letter written on his old stationery. "Mandy, if you're reading this, then you've done what I knew you would: stood your ground. You fought with facts, not fury. I'm proud of you, but remember, victory without grace becomes another form of loss. Don't let their failures define your peace. Forgive without forgetting, not for them but for yourself. Build something worth more than money. Build truth that lasts." The words blurred through tears I hadn't realized were falling. Graham stood quietly until I folded the letter back into its envelope. "He always knew what I needed before I did," I whispered. Graham smiled, that gentle warmth that only time gives a person. "He trusted you to finish the story. And I think you just did." That evening I returned to the shipyard, the first time since the trial. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, the sounds of cranes and seagulls mixing into something oddly comforting. Workers waved as I passed. Some had been with my father since before I was born. "You're back, Miss Collins," one of them said, grinning. "Feels right again." "Let's make it stay that way," I replied. The next week brought change. I removed the CFO who'd quietly enabled Vanessa's spending, promoted a young logistics manager who'd caught discrepancies and spoken up. We restructured the accounting system, digitized every record, and created an ethics committee, something Dad always wanted but never had time to finish. The company's numbers began to rise slowly, but what mattered more were the faces in the hallways, lighter, less afraid. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my office leaning against the doorway with that easy smirk of his. "You're making headlines again. Collins Maritime posts record growth under new leadership." I laughed softly. "Good. Maybe this time it's for the right reasons." He nodded toward the letter sitting framed on my desk. "He'd be proud." "I don't know," I said. "He'd probably say, 'You're not done yet.'" Daniel chuckled. "Sounds like him." A week later, we held a memorial service at the company headquarters to mark 1 year since his passing. The entire building was draped in navy and silver, the colors of every ship he'd ever commissioned. Hundreds came, employees, business partners, old friends, even a few rivals. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium, the company crest behind me, the microphone cold against my hand. "My father used to say, 'Ships aren't built to stay in the harbor,'" I began. "People aren't either." He believed in storms and facing them head on. "He taught me that truth might cost you everything, but losing it costs even more." I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. This company has weathered its share of storms this past year. But we're still here, because integrity floats, lies sink. The audience stayed silent, eyes fixed on me. "Legacy isn't about inheritance," I said. "It's about showing up when it's hardest." He did that for me. Now it's my turn. When I stepped back, the applause was thunderous. For a moment, I let myself breathe, not as his daughter, not as a CEO, just as someone continuing what he began. That night, after everyone left, I drove to the pier. The same place I'd met Graham months ago. The water shimmered under the moonlight, calm and endless. I sat on the railing holding one of my father's old journals that Graham had found in storage. The final entry read, "Leadership means carrying what breaks you and keeping it steady." I smiled. "You really didn't make it easy, did you?" I pulled a white sea anemone from my coat pocket and tossed it into the water. It floated for a moment before drifting out with the tide. For the first time, I whispered, "I don't feel like I'm living in your shadow. I'm walking beside it." When I returned to the office later that night, the building was dark except for my floor. I stopped in front of his old desk, the brass model ship still perched where he'd left it. I ran my hand across the cool metal, feeling its weight, its history. My phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "You all right?" I smiled faintly. "Yeah," I said. "For the first time, I really am." I hung up and looked out the window. Below, the harbor glowed under the nightlights. Ships were moving out to sea one by one, their lights flickering like stars on the water. He built the fleet. I'll steer it. The same ocean, a different captain. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the waves. 6 months after the memorial, the company was steady again. The chaos had finally quieted, and for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone was watching me. Profits were up, morale was strong, and every decision I made carried a quiet echo of my father's voice. I thought the storms were over. I should have known better. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand delivered by a clerk who wouldn't meet my eyes. Inside, notice of appeal, Collins Maritime Holdings. The plaintiffs, Elaine and Vanessa Morrison. They were taking me back to court. Again. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long, tired laugh. They just don't learn. Graham was already pacing my office. "We can settle this quietly. We'll handle it through counsel." "No," I interrupted. "I'm not hiding behind anyone this time. I'll testify myself." He hesitated. "You don't have to, Amanda. You already won." "Not if they're still trying to rewrite the story," I said. "This ends now." By the next morning, every major network had picked up the story. The Collins family feud returns. CEO faces new allegations of manipulation. Reporters camped outside the building, waiting for me to slip. On TV, Vanessa sat in a studio chair, wearing her signature black dress and carefully smeared eyeliner, pretending to cry. All we ever wanted was fairness, she said softly. Dad loved all his daughters equally. Amanda just changed after he passed. I turned off the TV. Daniel, sitting across from me, muttered, "She's good." Almost believable, almost, I said. But people can only pretend so long before the mask cracks. Still, the damage was real. Stock dipped 8% in 2 days. The board was nervous, investors anxious. But I wasn't shaken. I'd been through worse storms. And this time I wasn't just a grieving daughter, I was the head of a legacy. If truth built this company, I told Daniel, lies can't tear it down. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. The courtroom was bigger, colder, and louder than the first. Rows of reporters lined the back, cameras flickering like lightning. I stood beside Graham at the defense table, watching Elaine and Vanessa settle into their seats across the aisle. They wore matching black suits like twin mourners at a funeral. The irony didn't escape me. Their new attorney, Richard Graves, was known for his theatrics, sharp-tongued, sharper suits, and a talent for twisting truth until it begged for mercy. When the bailiff announced, "All rise," the air changed. Judge Henry Lawson entered, silver-haired and composed, eyes clear as winter light. When he looked up and saw me, he paused. "Miss Collins," he said slowly, "it's been a long time." I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I remember your lectures at Harvard. You were my father's student once." He nodded slightly. "And he was my teacher for life." The courtroom hushed. Even Graves shifted in his seat. Graves began with his usual flair. "Your Honor, this case is about greed disguised as virtue. My clients were wronged, cut out of their rightful inheritance by manipulation and emotional coercion." I didn't blink. When he finished, I rose. "This case," I said calmly, "is about responsibility disguised as blood." Judge Lawson's eyes flickered with something close to approval. "Proceed." Graves called my mother first. Elaine adjusted her pearls before speaking, her voice trembling on cue. "My husband was a proud man, but in his final months he wasn't himself. Amanda took advantage of his weakness. She made him believe she was the only one who cared." Graves nodded, encouraging. "And did he seem confused when he signed over company control? He seemed pressured." I could feel my jaw tighten. Elaine had spent her life rewriting history. Now she was performing it. When it was my turn to cross, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Mother," I said, "you testified my father was pressured." "By whom?" "By you," she snapped. "Then explain this." I handed the clerk a stack of documents. My father's signature, dated 8 months before his death, authorizing the transfer of control to me. "That's his writing, isn't it?" She hesitated. "Yes, but signed when he was still healthy, verified by his attorney and the company board. You were present that day. Or have you forgotten?" Her face froze. "I didn't turn him against you," I said quietly. "You did that yourself every time you chose greed over grace." The silence was sharp enough to cut. Graves tried to regain footing. "Objection, argumentative," sustained Lawson said mildly. But his gaze never left me. When Vanessa took the stand, she played the victim effortlessly, just like she always had. "I tried to help," she said tearfully. "Amanda shut me out of the company. Dad always wanted us to run it together." I rose again. "Is that why you withdrew $500,000 from the company's discretionary fund 2 days after his funeral?" Vanessa's lips parted. "That money was for personal expenses I finished. Jewelry, vacations, a new car. All charged to Collins Maritime. Tell me, Vanessa, was that Dad's vision of running it together?" She turned red. "You're twisting this." "No," I said, "I'm correcting it." Judge Lawson leaned back in his chair, pen tapping lightly. "Miss Collins," he said, "what was your father's final lesson to you?" I didn't hesitate. "That integrity outlives inheritance." He smiled faintly. "Wise man." After 2 days of testimony, the air in the courtroom felt heavy with exhaustion and truth. Graves gave one last desperate speech about bloodlines and betrayal, but his words fell flat. Everyone knew. The truth was too consistent to ignore. Judge Lawson cleared his throat and began reading the verdict. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this court finds that the plaintiff's appeal is without merit. The transfer of Collins Maritime Holdings stands as executed. All claims of undue influence are hereby denied. Elaine lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. Vanessa stood abruptly, whispering something to her attorney before storming out. Lawson continued, his tone softening. Charles Collins raised a daughter who understands the law better than most lawyers I've seen in this court. This judgment upholds not just his will but his faith in her. The gavel struck. 3 sharp knocks. Final. I didn't cheer. I didn't even smile. I just sat there, letting the relief wash over me slowly, quietly. When I turned to Graham, he nodded once. "It's over. This time for good," I whispered. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun cut through the clouds, spilling light over the marble steps. Reporters rushed forward, microphones flashing, voices overlapping. "Miss Collins, any comment on today's decision?" I stopped, met their eyes, and said, "No comment. Some truths don't need headlines." Daniel was waiting by the car. He opened the door but didn't move. "You finally free?" I looked up at the courthouse behind me, the place where every shadow of the past had been dragged into daylight. "No," I said. "I've just started to live." We drove off as the crowd thinned, the noise fading behind us. Through the window, I could still see the courthouse dome gleaming in the distance, steady and unmoving. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was the place where I stopped being the daughter who inherited a company and became the woman who earned it. The sea was calm that morning, the kind of quiet that made the world feel newly made. Sunlight spilled through the window of my new home on the coast, catching the silver edges of the photo frames on the shelf. My father smiling with wind-tangled hair, his arm around me the day we launched our first cargo ship together. For the first time, I didn't wake with that familiar ache of needing to prove something. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was living. A year had passed since the final verdict. The company had grown stronger than I could have imagined. Collins Maritime had become a leader in sustainable shipping, pioneering green technology and community partnerships. The headlines had changed too. From scandal to standard bearer, Amanda Collins redefines legacy. I'd stopped clipping them months ago. Validation wasn't what I was after anymore. I poured coffee and stepped onto the balcony. The ocean stretched, endless and clean sunlight scattering across the waves like shards of glass. For years I fought to protect my father's name, but now I finally understood I'd been trying to define my own. That weekend, I drove out to the cemetery on the hill overlooking the harbor. The wind carried the smell of salt and pine, the sound of gulls circling overhead. I parked by the familiar row where the grass always grew greener than anywhere else. His headstone was simple, just like he wanted Charles A. Collins' integrity is the true north. I knelt beside it, setting down a bouquet of white orchids and a small brass model of one of our ships. "It's safe now, Dad," I whispered. "Your legacy's safe." But I think you knew I'd do that. The granite was cool under my palm. I thought about all those nights he'd stayed up teaching me the balance between compassion and strength, how he made me memorize the phrase, "keep the compass steady." It sounded simple back then. Now I knew it was the hardest thing anyone could do. A breeze rose, suddenly soft but insistent, brushing through my hair like a hand. I smiled. "Message received," I murmured, leaving the ship at the base of the stone. "I'll keep steering." Back at headquarters later that week, the air was lighter than I remembered. Employees smiled when I passed, not because of hierarchy, but because they believed in what we'd built. We weren't just a company anymore, we were a promise. That morning, we were gathered in the atrium for a major announcement. Cameras clicked and dozens of faces turned toward me as I stepped to the podium. Today, I began. Collins Maritime opens a new chapter, not for profit, but for purpose. Behind me, a banner unfurled, the Charles Collins Foundation Scholarships for the next generation of mariners. The room erupted in applause. I continued. "My father built this company on integrity. Our future depends on keeping that promise. Every ship we build, every student we sponsor, every decision we make will honor that foundation. Afterward, a young man approached me, nervous, clutching his cap. "Collins, the scholarship. It changed my life," he said. "My dad worked the docks his whole life. He always said this company was different. Now I get to be part of it." For a moment I couldn't speak. "What's your name?" I asked. "Marcus." "Then make us proud, Marcus. Keep your compass steady." His grin reminded me of myself 20 years ago, standing in front of my father trying to live up to a name. Daniel found me afterward in the boardroom holding a folded newspaper. "You've done it again," he said, handing it to me. On the front page, Businesswoman of the Year, Amanda Collins brings heart to leadership. I laughed softly. He'd say, "Don't let it go to your head," Daniel chuckled. And then he'd pour a drink and say he's proud. "Yeah," I said quietly. He would. Later that night, long after everyone had gone home, I sat in my office, lights dimmed, the city glittering below. The harbor was dotted with moving lights, our ships each carrying their own story. My reflection in the glass looked older, steadier, maybe even a little wiser. For years I thought inheritance was about wealth, but it's not. It's about values, what survives after you're gone. He gave me everything that mattered: resilience, clarity, a moral compass that never wavered even when I did. I turned toward the photo on the wall, my father and me standing on the docks, wind whipping through our hair. He'd always said, "Love isn't a memory, Amanda. It's a verb." I understood now. His love didn't end when he died. It lived in every decision I made, every person I helped, every ship that sailed under our name. Outside, the last light of sunset spread gold across the horizon. I closed my laptop and whispered to the empty room, "Thank you." That weekend, I sat at home writing in the leather journal he'd given me when I first became CEO. The last page was still blank, so I filled it. I used to think justice was about punishment. Now I know it's about peace. I used to think legacy was about inheritance. Now I know it's about influence, how your choices outlive you, how your courage becomes someone else's permission. I put down the pen, leaned back, and watched the reflection of the ships moving beyond the glass. The phone buzzed. Daniel again. "You at the office?" he asked. "No, home." "Strange hearing that from you," he teased. "Yeah," I said. "It's strange, but it feels right." Outside, waves whispered against the rocks. I could almost hear my father's voice folded inside their rhythm. "Keep the compass steady." He gave me a company, but what he really left me was courage. The courage to stand for truth, to build family not through blood, but through action. To choose integrity when it costs the most. I stood by the window watching the harbor lights fade into the night. For the first time, I felt whole. And if anyone had asked me then what inheritance truly means, I would have said this. It's the strength to become everything your parents hoped for and more. I turned off the lights and let the silence fill the room. The ocean kept its rhythm. The ships kept moving forward. And so did I. If you've ever had to define family on your own terms, if you've ever fought to protect something worth more than money, tell me your story. Because legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you build when no one's watching.